I have to be honest with you, tonight's stories feel a little different. Not scarier, just closer. The kind that make you glance at your door once before you settle in. Welcome to Sleepy Shadows, your nightly wind down into quiet horror. If tonight's been a long one, let these stories be the exhale. Comment below and tell me what kept you up tonight. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe, the shadows will be waiting. Now, lights down, breath slow, here we go. Forgotten Forest Gate. When I was in primary school, there was a forest directly behind the school grounds. It wasn't the kind of place we were supposed to explore. A tall fence surrounded it, blocking anyone from getting inside, and all of us grew up assuming there was a good reason for that. At some point, though, someone broke part of the fence. It wasn't a huge opening, but it was big enough for people to squeeze through. Once that happened, kids started sneaking into the forest whenever they had the chance. It became one of those places that everyone knew about but wasn't supposed to visit. The adults always warned us to stay away, which only made it more interesting. As children, we were naturally curious. Every time someone claimed they had gone into the woods, they'd come back with another story. Some talked about hearing strange noises. Others said they felt like they were being watched the whole time. Most of the stories changed a little each time they were told, but one story stayed exactly the same. It was the story of the Blue Lady. I don't even remember when I first heard it. It felt like one of those local legends that everyone simply knew. Older kids whispered about it, younger kids repeated it, and somehow the story always found its way back into conversations. Whenever someone mentioned the forest, my cousin was the one who told me the full version. According to them, the forest hadn't always been closed off. Years earlier, anyone could walk through it whenever they wanted. Families, children, and people from the neighborhood supposedly treated it like any other small woodland. There was nothing unusual about it back then. Then people started seeing something, or someone. The story said that children kept reporting the same figure deep among the trees. A woman dressed in blue. Not modern clothes. Victorian clothing. She was always described the same way, wearing a long blue Victorian dress and pushing an old-fashioned Victorian baby pram. At first, the teachers didn't believe any of it. They assumed the children were making up ghost stories, trying to frighten one another during recess or after school. After all, children have vivid imaginations, and stories like that spread quickly. No one took the sightings seriously. But according to the version my cousin told me, that changed one day. The teachers eventually decided to go into the forest themselves. Maybe they wanted to prove the stories wrong. Maybe they wanted to find out why so many students kept talking about the same mysterious woman. Whatever the reason was, they went in. They never saw the woman. At least, that's not how the story goes. Instead, they supposedly found something else. An old, broken pram. Not a modern stroller. A pram that looked like it belonged to another time. The kind you would expect to see in old photographs from the Victorian era. That discovery was supposed to be the reason the forest was eventually closed off. Whether that was actually true, I have no idea. That's simply how the story was always told. When I was little, I believed every word of it. My younger cousin believed it too. Neither of us questioned whether the story made sense. We just accepted it as fact, because it came from someone older than us, and because every mysterious place seems to come with its own ghost story. The image of that blue lady stayed in my mind. Whenever I looked toward the trees behind the school, I imagined her somewhere inside, silently pushing that old pram through the forest where no one could see her. It didn't matter that I'd never actually seen anything strange. The story alone was enough. For quite a while, it kept both of us away from the forest. Even after someone damaged the fence and made it possible to get inside, we refused to go anywhere near the opening. Other children would dare each other to squeeze through. Some came back laughing. Others claimed they'd heard noises or caught glimpses of movement between the trees. Whether they really experienced anything or simply enjoyed making the stories bigger, I couldn't say. At that age, every new rumor sounded believable. Every shadow suddenly had meaning. Every strange sound became proof that the stories were real. Looking back now, I realize how powerful imagination can be. The forest itself wasn't especially unusual. It was simply a patch of woodland behind an old primary school. Like most forests, it had uneven ground, thick trees, tangled bushes, and plenty of places where sunlight barely reached the ground. Branches creaked whenever the wind picked up. Leaves rustled even when you couldn't immediately tell what had caused them to move. It didn't take much for ordinary sounds to become something mysterious when you already expected to find ghosts. As the years passed, though, things changed. We got older. The fear that had once kept us away slowly disappeared. Eventually, curiosity became stronger than the stories we'd grown up hearing. The first few times we went into the forest, we didn't go alone. There were always other people with us. Being in a group made everything feel less frightening. We'd laugh, explore the paths, and point out anything that looked unusual, even though deep down I think some small part of all of us still wondered whether we'd stumble across something impossible. Nothing ever happened. No blue lady. No mysterious figure dressed in Victorian clothing. No old woman pushing a pram through the trees. No strange voices. No unexplained shadows. Certainly no ghost. The forest turned out to be exactly what it appeared to be. Just a forest. Even so, every visit reminded me of the stories I'd heard growing up. Sometimes we'd pass an unusually shaped tree, or notice an area where the undergrowth was especially thick, and someone would casually mention the blue lady again. The story never completely disappeared. It simply became something people talked about for fun, rather than something they genuinely feared. Now that we're older, none of us are really scared anymore. We still go there from time to time. The broken section of the fence has long since become just another part of the place. And walking through the woods doesn't carry the same excitement it once did. Still, whenever someone brings up the old legend, I find myself remembering exactly how convincing it sounded when I was a child. I also wonder how the story first began. Was there ever really an old pram found somewhere in the forest? Did someone actually see a woman dressed in Victorian clothing? Or did one child's imagination slowly grow into a local legend that lasted for years? I honestly don't know. Sometimes I think my cousin may have invented the whole thing simply to stop me and my younger cousin from wandering into the woods. If that was the goal, it worked perfectly. For a long time, we wouldn't go anywhere near that broken fence, because we were convinced the blue lady might still be wandering between the trees. Other times, I wonder if my cousin had simply repeated a story they'd heard from someone else. That's how local legends survive. One person tells another, who tells someone else. And before long, nobody remembers where the story originally came from. All they remember is the ghost. Even now, I can't say whether any part of it was true. I've never seen anything unusual in that forest. Neither have any of the friends I've gone there with over the years. Every visit has been completely ordinary, and yet the story has never left me. Whenever I think back to my old primary school, I don't just remember classrooms, playgrounds, or lessons. I remember the forest behind the school. I remember the broken fence that invited curious children inside. Most of all, I remember the story of the blue lady in her Victorian dress, quietly pushing an old Victorian pram somewhere beneath the trees. Whether she ever existed or not is something I'll probably never know. Maybe it was nothing more than a story told to keep curious children out of a dangerous forest. Maybe it was a rumor that grew larger every time someone repeated it. Or maybe every local legend begins with something that nobody can fully explain. Whatever the truth may be, that old ghost story is still one of the most memorable things I carried with me from my years at primary school. Even after growing up, even after walking through those woods myself and finding nothing unusual, I still think about it whenever someone mentions haunted places. Sometimes the stories we hear as children stay with us far longer than the fear itself, quietly lingering in the back of our minds like old memories that never completely fade. His last joke? I was staying overnight at my mom's condo one evening, but for whatever reason, I just couldn't fall asleep. I lay awake for what felt like hours, hoping I'd eventually drift off, but it never happened. By around 2 o'clock in the morning, I gave up trying. Rather than continue staring at the ceiling, I got out of bed and opened my mom's laptop to pass the time. The condo was completely quiet. I was sitting there in the middle of the night, focused on the screen, when I suddenly heard something from my left side. It was my late uncle's voice. Clear as day, I heard him say, "I feel like a fucking spice." Ha ha ha. The comment caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I just sat there in silence. It sounded exactly like his sense of humor, unexpected, sarcastic, and the kind of joke that would have made him laugh. Even so, I didn't know what to think. It was the middle of the night, I was exhausted, and I figured my tired brain had probably played a trick on me. I didn't panic. I didn't go searching through the condo. I simply brushed it off, telling myself I was overtired and imagining things. The next day, I was talking with my cousin, who is my late uncle's daughter. At some point, I mentioned what had happened the night before. I told her I'd heard her dad's voice while I was awake in the middle of the night and repeated exactly what he'd said. The moment she heard it, she burst out laughing. Then she said something that completely caught me by surprise. "I have his ashes in the spice cabinet." I just stared at her. She lives on the other side of the country. I'd never been to her house. We had never talked about where she kept his ashes. As far as I knew, there was no way I could have known that. That's what has stayed with me all these years. It wasn't the fact that I thought I heard my late uncle's voice. It was the joke itself. Whether it was an incredible coincidence, a tired mind putting random thoughts together, or something I'll never be able to explain, the punchline somehow matched a detail I couldn't have known. More than anything, though, the experience didn't frighten me. It felt comforting. If there really was something to it, then it felt exactly like the kind of joke my uncle would have made. For one brief moment, it was as if I caught one last glimpse of his personality and his sense of humor. I've never forgotten it. Just beyond the headlights. Back in 2010, I was in my first year of college and working at Taco Bell to help pay the bills. It wasn't glamorous, but I enjoyed the job, mostly because of the people I worked with. One of them was my manager. Over time, we became good friends, and we're still friends today. Around that time, his truck finally gave up on him. It completely broke down, and until he could get it repaired, he didn't have a way to get home after our late shifts. Since we usually closed together anyway, I started driving him home whenever we worked the closing shift. It became part of our routine. We'd finish cleaning the restaurant, lock everything up, climb into my car, and head out through the quiet streets, while everyone else seemed to be asleep. Most nights were uneventful. We'd talk about work, college, random life problems, or whatever happened to be on the radio. One station we listened to quite a bit was Coast to Coast AM. If you've ever listened to it, you know it covers all kinds of unusual topics: ghosts, UFOs, unexplained sightings, conspiracy theories, and pretty much anything mysterious. Whether we believed everything we heard or not, it was entertaining, especially during long drives home in the middle of the night. One particular night still stands out in my memory. We had just finished closing the restaurant and were driving through a suburban neighborhood on the way to his house. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning. The streets were completely empty. There were no pedestrians, almost no traffic. The most of the houses were dark, and the entire neighborhood had that strange stillness that only seems to exist in the early hours before dawn. Because the roads were so empty, I had my high beams on. They stretched far ahead of us, lighting up the road and everything directly in front of the car. We weren't talking much. The radio was playing quietly in the background, while we both looked ahead. Then, at almost exactly the same moment, we both noticed something. Just beyond the reach of the headlights, there was the outline of a man. He wasn't standing directly in the road. He was just outside the brightest part of the light, close enough to see clearly but still surrounded by darkness. Neither of us said anything immediately. We were both simply looking at him. As the car continued moving forward, the figure stepped into the path of the headlights. For the briefest moment, I expected the light to fully illuminate him. Instead, he disappeared, not by walking away, not by running, not by moving behind a tree or another car. He simply wasn't there anymore. One instant he was visible, the next instant there was nothing. The road ahead was completely empty. I instinctively glanced over at my manager. At the exact same moment, he turned and looked at me. Neither of us needed to ask the obvious question. The expressions on our faces answered it. We had both seen the same thing. There was a long second where neither of us spoke. It wasn't because we were too frightened to talk. It was because we were silently confirming that the other person had witnessed exactly what had just happened. Finally, one of us asked something along the lines of, "You saw that too?" The answer came immediately. Neither of us had imagined it alone. That was the part that stayed with me. If I'd been by myself, I probably would have convinced myself there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe I'd mistaken a shadow for a person. Maybe fatigue after work had affected my perception. Maybe the lighting had created some strange illusion. Driving late at night after a long shift can certainly play tricks on your eyes. But I wasn't alone. My manager looked up at exactly the same time I did. He watched the figure enter the headlights. He watched it disappear. We both reacted independently, before either of us said a word. That made it much harder to dismiss. The strange thing is that the experience itself wasn't dramatic. There wasn't any loud noise. The figure didn't approach the car. It didn't wave. It didn't speak. Nothing chased us. There was no overwhelming sense of fear. It was almost absurdly simple. A man-shaped figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. A step forward. Gone. It almost felt like someone playing a game of peekaboo. 1 second there. 1 second not. We kept driving. There wasn't much else we could do. I don't even remember whether we turned the radio down afterward. I mostly remember replaying the image in my mind, while trying to understand what we'd witnessed. The roads remained empty. Nothing else unusual happened during the drive. I dropped my manager off at home and eventually went back to my own place, but I found myself thinking about it long after the night had ended. Over the years, I've had plenty of other experiences that people would probably describe as paranormal. Some of them were stranger. Some were much creepier. A few were far more difficult to explain. Yet this one has always stood out for a different reason. It was so straightforward. There wasn't much room for interpretation. We both looked up. We both saw the same figure. We both watched it disappear. That's it. No complicated sequence of events. No uncertainty about whether I'd been alone. No delayed realization. It happened in front of both of us at exactly the same time. Because of that, it's probably the easiest experience I have when someone asks why I sometimes hesitate before dismissing stories about unexplained sightings. I'm still a fairly rational person. I think there are usually ordinary explanations for extraordinary claims. People misinterpret shadows. Fatigue affects perception. The human brain naturally tries to recognize familiar shapes, especially in poor lighting. I know all of that. Those explanations make sense, and maybe one of them applies here too. It's entirely possible. At the same time, I can't ignore the fact that there were two of us in the car. Neither of us suggested what we'd seen before the other reacted. Neither of us had time to influence the other's memory. We simply looked at the same spot, at the same moment, and watched the same impossible thing happen. I still don't know what it was. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation hidden somewhere in the darkness that neither of us noticed. Maybe our brains briefly interpreted the same visual information in the same unusual way, or maybe it was something I'll never be able to explain. I honestly don't know. All I know is that whenever I think back to those late-night drives after closing Taco Bell, I remember the quiet suburban streets, the empty roads stretching ahead beneath the high beams, coast to coast and drifting softly through the speakers, and that lone figure standing just outside the light. For one brief moment, it seemed completely real, waiting at the edge of the darkness until the headlights finally reached it. Then, as if someone had simply erased it from the road, it vanished without a trace. It wasn't the strangest thing I've ever experienced, and it certainly wasn't the scariest, but it remains the clearest, simplest, and hardest to dismiss unexplained sighting I've ever had. One last visit. When I was 19 years old, my grandfather was dying from cancer. By that point, our family knew the end was near. Watching someone you love slowly fade away is never easy, and seeing him become weaker with each passing day was heartbreaking. The strong, healthy man I had known for most of my life had become frail, and we were all trying to prepare ourselves for what we knew was coming. One night, while I was asleep, I suddenly woke up. Standing beside my bed was my grandfather. The first thing I noticed was that he didn't look sick anymore. He wasn't the thin, exhausted man we had grown accustomed to seeing during the final stages of his illness. Instead, he looked healthy, strong, just as I remembered him before cancer had changed him. There was nothing frightening about seeing him there. In fact, the entire room felt strangely peaceful. He smiled at me, and in a calm, gentle voice, he said that he had just stopped by to tell me he loved me. Then he told me that I would see him again someday. That was all. There was no fear, no confusion, just a deep feeling of comfort that settled over me the moment he spoke. For some reason, I didn't question what was happening. It felt completely natural. After hearing his words, I simply closed my eyes again and went back to sleep, carrying that overwhelming sense of peace with me. The next time I woke up, it wasn't because of another dream. It was because my phone was ringing. I reached over and saw that it was my mother calling. Before I even answered, Something inside me already knew why she was calling. The moment I picked up the phone, I spoke before she had the chance to say anything. "Grandpa died, didn't he?" There was a brief silence. Then my mother quietly answered, "Yes." She had called to tell me that he had passed away. I told her about what had happened during the night. I described waking up to find Grandpa standing beside my bed, looking healthy again, and how he had told me he loved me and that I would see him again. I explained how peaceful the experience had felt and how I had simply gone back to sleep afterward. When I finished, my mother wasn't shocked. Instead, she gently told me that she wasn't surprised. She said it made perfect sense to her that he would stop by to say goodbye to me. I hadn't been able to be with him during his final days, and she believed that this was his way of letting me know he loved me before he left. I've thought about that night many times over the years. I've considered every possible explanation. Maybe it was a vivid dream brought on by knowing my grandfather was close to the end. Maybe my mind created the experience as a way of preparing me for the phone call that came the next morning. Those explanations are certainly possible. But what has always stayed with me wasn't simply seeing him. It was how different he looked. The illness was gone. He appeared exactly as I remembered him from before cancer had taken so much from him. And more than anything else, I remember the feeling. I've never experienced peace quite like that before or since. Whether it was a dream, my imagination, or something I'll never fully understand, I can't say. All I know is that, before anyone told me he was gone, I woke to find my grandfather standing beside my bed one last time. He told me he loved me. He promised that I would see him again. Then, only a short while later, the phone rang, and I already knew why. Shadow at the bedside. This story didn't happen to me. It happened to my granddad, and it's the only reason I've ever seriously considered that some things can't be easily explained. My granddad was never the type of person to believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything paranormal. If someone told him they had seen a ghost, he'd usually dismiss it without giving it much thought. He was practical, logical, and always looked for an ordinary explanation before anything else. That's what makes this story so difficult for me to ignore. It wasn't told by someone who wanted to believe. It was told by someone who spent most of his life believing there was no such thing. The experience happened after my grandma suffered a stroke. It changed life for both of them, almost overnight. The stroke left her with very limited mobility, and she needed constant care while she recovered. Because of that, she spent time in a care home where she could receive the support and rehabilitation she needed. It was an incredibly difficult period for the whole family. My granddad hated seeing her there. More than anything, he wanted to bring her home and look after her himself. He wanted her somewhere familiar, somewhere comfortable, where he could be the one taking care of her every day. Eventually, that became possible. When she returned home, they made several changes around the house to make life easier for her. One of those changes was surprisingly simple. They swapped sides of the bed. For their entire marriage, they had always slept on the same sides, but now it made more sense for my grandma to sleep nearest the bedroom door. That way, she would have easier access to the bathroom, and it would be simpler for my granddad to help her if she needed anything during the night. It was a small adjustment, but an important one. Their nightly routine changed with it. Because my grandma occasionally needed assistance, they developed the habit of leaving the bedroom door slightly open. The hallway light stayed on throughout the night. That way, if either of them woke up, There was enough light filtering into the room to see without needing to switch on a lamp. One night, sometime after she had come home, my granddad woke up unexpectedly. The room was quiet. The only light came from the hallway, spilling softly through the partially open bedroom door. At first, everything seemed normal. Then he noticed something that instantly made him sit up from where he was lying. It looked as though my grandma was sitting upright on the edge of the bed. His first reaction wasn't fear. It was concern, given everything she'd been through. His immediate thought was that she had somehow managed to get herself up and might be trying to stand or walk on her own. He worried she could fall. Without hesitating, he started moving toward her side of the bed to help. As he got closer, something didn't look right. The shape he had seen wasn't actually my grandma sitting up. She was still lying flat in bed, fast asleep. What he had mistaken for her was something else entirely. Hovering over her was a dark shadow. He described it as a black shape positioned above her bed, not attached to anything, not cast by furniture, simply a dark figure hanging over her while she slept. For a brief moment, he just stared. Then he took another step closer. As he approached, the shadow began to move. It didn't rush. It didn't suddenly disappear. Instead, it drifted away from the bed. It moved slowly toward the bedroom door. My granddad watched it cross the room in silence. It reached the doorway. Then it vanished. There was no sound, no flash of light, no dramatic ending. It simply disappeared as it reached the open door. My grandma never woke up. She remained asleep the entire time. My granddad stood there, looking at her, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. He checked on her immediately. She was fine, still sleeping peacefully. Nothing else seemed unusual about the room. The hallway light was still on. The bedroom looked exactly the way it always did. Only the shadow was gone. For someone who had never believed in ghosts or anything paranormal, the experience deeply unsettled him. He wasn't the type of person to exaggerate stories. He wasn't interested in convincing people that supernatural things existed. In fact, he was probably the last person anyone in the family would expect to tell a story like that. That's one of the reasons it stayed with everyone who heard it. He genuinely couldn't explain what he'd seen. He didn't claim it was definitely a ghost. He didn't insist it had been some kind of spirit. He simply described exactly what happened as he remembered it. He woke up. He thought my grandma was sitting on the edge of the bed. As he got closer, he realized she had never moved at all. A dark shadow had been hanging over her instead. When he approached, it quietly moved away and disappeared through the bedroom doorway. That was the entire story. Nothing else happened afterward. There were no more sightings, no strange voices, no unexplained events that followed. My grandma continued recovering, and life gradually settled into a routine again. As far as I know, my granddad never experienced anything similar before or after that night. Even now, I don't know what to make of it. There are certainly possible explanations. People can wake suddenly and briefly misinterpret what they're seeing in low light. Sleep inertia, unusual shadows, and the transition between sleeping and waking can sometimes create surprisingly vivid experiences. Munkel. Those explanations make sense. At the same time, they don't completely explain why the experience affected my granddad so deeply. Munkel. He wasn't someone who frightened easily. He wasn't interested in ghost stories. If anything, he usually dismissed them. For him to quietly admit that he had seen something he couldn't explain carried far more weight than if the story had come from someone who already believed in the paranormal. I've often wondered whether the stress of caring for my grandma after her stroke played a role. He worried about her constantly. He was exhausted much of the time. anyone in that situation would be. Perhaps his mind briefly turned a combination of darkness and concern into something that wasn't really there. That's entirely possible. Or perhaps he witnessed something that simply doesn't fit neatly into any explanation. I honestly don't know. All I know is that this story has remained in our family for years, not because anyone insists it proves the existence of ghosts, but because it came from the one person who would have been the first to dismiss a story like it. Whenever I think about it, I picture that quiet bedroom with the hall light spilling through the partly open door, my grandma asleep beneath the blankets, and my granddad hurrying around the bed because he believed she needed his help. Instead, he found a silent, dark shadow hanging over her, one that calmly drifted toward the doorway and disappeared before his eyes. Whether it was a trick of the light, the mind playing strange games in the moments between sleep and wakefulness, or something far more difficult to explain, it's a memory he carried with him for the rest of his life, and one that none of us in the family have ever completely forgotten. Silent Woman's Face. When I was about 9 years old, my brothers and I were playing with a ball in the living room one afternoon. It was an ordinary day, the kind where you're just trying to keep yourselves entertained without really thinking about anything else. We were laughing, throwing the ball back and forth, and making far more noise than we probably should have. At some point, someone threw the ball a little too hard. It bounced through the doorway into one of the bedrooms and rolled underneath the bunk beds. Since I was the closest, I volunteered to get it. I dropped onto my hands and knees and crawled beneath the bed. It was dusty under there, and the light coming through the bedroom window only reached part of the floor. I could see the ball sitting just out of reach near the wall. I stretched my arm toward it. As I reached for the ball, something happened that I have never been able to explain. A face suddenly appeared on the wall directly in front of me. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A woman's face. It seemed to glow with a soft light that made it stand out clearly against the wall. Her hair floated all around her as though it were drifting underwater or moving through a breeze that I couldn't feel. It wasn't wild or frightening in the way horror movies often portray ghosts. It was strangely calm. Her lips were moving. She was clearly trying to say something, but there wasn't a single sound. No whisper, no voice, nothing. I remember staring at her completely frozen. It wasn't a decision. My body simply wouldn't move. I was terrified, but at the same time I couldn't look away. Every part of my attention was fixed on that silent face. I don't know how long it lasted. It might have been only a few seconds. It might have been longer. Time felt strangely suspended while I was looking at her. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she disappeared. There was no fading away, no dramatic effect. One moment she was there. The next, she wasn't. Almost immediately, the feeling that had kept me frozen vanished too. It was as though someone had suddenly released me. I grabbed the ball without even thinking about it and scrambled backward as fast as I could. I practically threw myself out from underneath the bunk beds before jumping to my feet and running out of the bedroom. I was panicking. I told my brothers that I had just seen a ghost. They laughed. To them it was ridiculous. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was still shining brightly outside. The house was filled with daylight. As far as they were concerned, ghosts were supposed to appear in the middle of the night, not during a sunny afternoon. They teased me for being scared. Looking back, I can't really blame them. If someone else had told me that exact story, I probably would have reacted the same way. Eventually, life moved on. The experience stayed with me, but I stopped talking about it. There wasn't much point. Nobody believed me anyway, As the years passed, I found myself questioning my own memory from time to time. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half daydreaming while crawling under the bed. Maybe it had been some strange combination of shadows and a child's imagination. I never found an explanation that completely satisfied me. But I also never experienced anything remotely similar again. About 10 years later, my older brother and I ended up attending the same university. By then, we were adults. Like most siblings who were close in age, we'd occasionally spend time together with mutual friends. One evening, we were at a small gathering, sitting around, talking, having a few drinks, and drifting from one conversation to another. Eventually, the topic turned toward philosophy. From there, someone brought up life after death. Before long, everyone was sharing opinions about whether they believed in ghosts, spirits, or any kind of afterlife. I remember saying that I was generally skeptical. I've always been the type of person who wants evidence before believing extraordinary claims. Even then, I admitted there was only one reason I couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that something exists beyond death. When I was a child, I had seen something I couldn't explain, so I started telling the story. I hadn't even gotten very far before my brother suddenly interrupted me. I looked over at him. The color had completely drained from his face. He looked genuinely shaken. He stopped me before I could continue. "Wait," he said. His voice sounded different. "That ghost." He paused for a moment. "Was it a woman?" I nodded. He continued. "Was it just her face?" Again, I nodded. He kept staring at me. "Was she glowing?" I could already feel chills spreading through me. I answered yes. Then he asked one more question. "Did she have long flowing hair? And were her lips moving even though no sound came out?" I don't think I've ever been as stunned as I was in that moment. Every detail he mentioned matched exactly what I had experienced. Not most of it, all of it. The glowing face, the flowing hair, the silent moving lips. Everything. The strange part wasn't just that he recognized the description. It was that we had never discussed it before. The only conversation we'd ever had about my experience happened immediately after I ran out of the bedroom as a kid. I'd yelled that I'd seen a ghost. Everyone laughed. That was the end of it. I'd never described what I'd actually seen. Not to him, not to anyone. There was no reason he should have known those details. My brother looked just as shocked as I felt. He slowly explained that when he was a child, he had seen exactly the same thing. It hadn't happened in the bedroom. It happened in another room of the house. Unlike my experience, it was after dark, but everything else was identical. A glowing woman's face, long flowing hair, lips moving without making a sound. He admitted that he'd always assumed it had been a dream. Children have strange dreams all the time, and as the years passed, he had convinced himself that it couldn't have been real. Until I began telling my own story. Hearing me describe the same face forced him to reconsider everything he thought he remembered. For a while, neither of us really knew what to say. Our friends were just as surprised as we were. The conversation shifted away from debating philosophy and turned entirely toward trying to understand how two people could remember the exact same impossible experience. We searched for ordinary explanations. Maybe one of us had unknowingly influenced the other's memory somehow. Maybe we'd talked about it years earlier and forgotten. Maybe our childhood memories had somehow blended together over time. But none of those explanations seemed convincing. I had never described the face. He had never told me about his experience. Neither of us had any reason to invent identical details independently. Even now, years later, I still don't know what to make of it. The strange thing is that I'm naturally a skeptical person. Whenever someone tells me a ghost story, My first instinct is usually to doubt it. I tend to look for ordinary explanations before considering anything supernatural. Most stories can usually be explained by coincidence, mistaken identity, sleep paralysis, dreams, faulty memory, or people unintentionally exaggerating what happened. That's simply how my mind works, which makes this experience especially frustrating. If someone else told me this exact story, I'd probably react the same way I react to most ghost stories. I'd smile politely. I'd assume there had to be a reasonable explanation. I'd suspect memory had changed over time. I'd probably conclude that there was some perfectly ordinary cause that simply wasn't obvious. Yet when I apply that same skepticism to my own experience, I keep running into the same problem. There are two witnesses, separated by roughly 10 years, neither aware that the other had experienced anything unusual, both describing the same silent, glowing woman's face in remarkable detail. I still don't know whether what we experienced was real. Maybe there really was something neither of us could explain. Maybe our minds somehow created the same false memory without us realizing it. Maybe coincidence played a larger role than it seems, or maybe there is an explanation that simply hasn't occurred to either of us. I honestly don't know. The older I get, the less certain I become. I've never seen that woman again. Neither has my brother. Nothing else remotely similar has happened to either of us since childhood. Our lives have been completely ordinary, and yet that one strange memory continues to linger in the background, quietly resisting every logical explanation I've tried to give it. Out of all the ghost stories I've heard over the years, this is still the only one that genuinely makes me stop and wonder, not because I expect anyone else to believe it, but because I lived through it myself. To this day, I still don't know whether I saw something impossible or whether my mind somehow constructed an incredibly convincing illusion. The only thing that keeps me from dismissing it completely is the fact that my brother, without any prompting, described the very same silent face I remembered from beneath those bunk beds. Whether it was a shared coincidence, a pair of matching false memories, or something neither of us can explain, I honestly have no idea. It doesn't fit the way I think the world works, and that's exactly why it has stayed with me for so many years. The day he saw her, my grandfather loved my grandmother more than anything. The two of them had the kind of relationship that everyone around them noticed. He never missed an opportunity to tell her how beautiful she was, even after they had been married for years. He was always finding little ways to make her smile, even if it meant embarrassing himself in front of everyone else. He didn't care. If it made her laugh, it was worth it. Growing up, it was obvious how much they loved each other. They were the kind of couple who made being together look effortless. They enjoyed each other's company, teased one another, and somehow managed to keep that warmth between them throughout their entire marriage. Then, everything changed. My grandmother was diagnosed with cancer. Only a few months later, she was gone. Her death devastated my grandfather. For a long time, he struggled with the loss. Anyone who knew him could see how deeply it affected him. The house felt quieter without her, and although he slowly learned how to live with the grief, it was clear that a part of him had disappeared with her. Eventually, life moved forward. My grandfather continued living for another 18 years. As he grew older, though, his health began to decline in a different way. He developed Alzheimer's disease. At first, it was small things, forgetting conversations, misplacing everyday items, repeating stories. Over time, the illness became much worse. One of the hardest parts for our family was that he eventually forgot my grandmother had died. To him, she was still alive. He would ask where she was. Sometimes he'd call out for her from another room, expecting her to answer the way she always had. Whenever he asked us where she had gone, we'd explain that she had passed away. Every single time, it was as though he was hearing the news for the first time. The realization crushed him. He'd become confused, heartbroken, and visibly distressed all over again. Watching him relive that grief over and over was unbearable. Eventually, our family made a difficult decision. Instead of reminding him that she had died, we began giving him a gentler answer. Whenever he asked where she was, we'd smile and say, "She'll be back soon." Or we'd tell him she had stepped out to run a few errands. It wasn't about lying to him. It was about protecting him from experiencing the same heartbreak again and again. Most of the time, that answer seemed to comfort him. He would accept it and eventually move on to something else. Then, about a month before he passed away, something happened that none of us have ever forgotten. I was visiting his house with my mother. The three of us were sitting together quietly in the living room. It was an ordinary day. Nothing unusual had happened. My grandfather was sitting in his favorite chair, and we were simply spending time together. Without any warning, he suddenly looked around the room. Then he asked where my grandmother was. We answered the same way we always did. "She'll be back soon." We told him she had only gone out to take care of a few things and would be home before long. Usually, that was enough. This time it wasn't. He asked again. His voice sounded more urgent. We repeated the same answer, hoping it would reassure him. Instead, he became more determined. He insisted that he wanted to see her. We gently told him once more that she would be back soon. But he wouldn't let it go. He began calling her name. At first it was loud, then louder. Soon he was shouting for her as loudly as he possibly could, over and over again. He kept calling for his wife with a desperation that neither my mother nor I had ever seen before. The room felt tense. Neither of us knew what to do except try to calm him. Then something happened. Without any warning, every door and every window in the living room flew open at exactly the same moment. Not one after another, all at once. The sound filled the room. For a second, my mother and I were too stunned to react. The obvious explanation would be the wind. But there was one problem. Every door and window in the house was kept securely locked. Because of my grandfather's Alzheimer's, we always made sure everything stayed locked. He had wandered away before, and he often forgot to lock doors behind him. For his own safety, the locks were always secured, yet somehow every one of them opened simultaneously. Before either of us could say a word, my grandfather looked toward the front door. He wasn't looking at us anymore. He was looking at someone standing there, at least someone he could clearly see. His entire expression changed. The panic disappeared. Instead, he smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind we hadn't seen in quite a while. Still looking toward the doorway, he quietly said, "What took you so long? I've been waiting for you." His voice was completely calm. All the fear and confusion from only moments earlier had vanished. My mother and I looked toward the front door. We didn't see anyone. The doorway was empty. No one had entered the house. No one was standing there, but my grandfather never looked away. He continued smiling as though he were looking directly at the person he had been waiting 18 years to see again. Neither my mother nor I said anything. There didn't seem to be anything we could say. The room had become strangely peaceful. Whatever my grandfather was seeing, it brought him comfort. About a month later, he passed away. I've thought about that afternoon many times since then. There are logical possibilities. Alzheimer's can affect perception in ways that are difficult to understand. People nearing the end of life sometimes report seeing loved ones who have already passed away. Doctors and researchers have documented experiences like that for years. Maybe what happened that day was connected to his illness. Maybe it was connected to something we still don't fully understand about the final stages of life. And maybe there was an ordinary explanation for the doors and windows opening at the same time. I honestly don't know. What I do know is what I witnessed. I saw my grandfather desperately calling for the woman he had loved his entire life. I saw every locked door and window suddenly swing open, and I saw the expression on his face transform from fear into complete peace as he looked toward someone, my mother, and I couldn't see. To this day, I believe he saw my grandmother. After 18 years apart, I like to think she had finally come back for him. Whether that's what really happened or not, I'll never be able to prove. But whenever I remember that afternoon, I don't think about fear. I think about a man who spent his whole life loving one woman. And in one quiet moment, just before the end of his own journey, he smiled as though the person he'd been waiting for had finally walked through the front door. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Sleepy Shadows for daily calm horror stories made for late nights and sleep. You can also turn on notifications so you don't miss a new story when the night gets quiet and the shadows return. Now, let's continue. The Gettysburg Watchers. When I was 13 years old, my family took a trip to Gettysburg to visit the famous battlefield. It was one of those family vacations where we wanted to see places that were important to history, and Gettysburg was at the top of the list. I remember being excited, but mostly because I enjoyed exploring new places. At that age, I didn't know every detail of the battle or fully appreciate how significant the location was. To me, it was simply a place I'd heard about in school, somewhere with an incredible amount of history behind it. The drive there felt completely normal. We spent hours on the road, talking, looking out the windows, and asking the usual questions about how much farther we had to go. Eventually, we reached the area around the battlefield and began driving through the quiet country roads that surrounded it. The scenery immediately stood out. There were wide open fields stretching into the distance, old split-rail fences running alongside the roads, patches of trees, and gently rolling hills. Even without knowing much about history, the landscape felt different somehow. It was peaceful, almost unusually quiet, as though time had slowed down there. As we continued driving, I found myself looking out the passenger side window. That's when I saw them. Standing along the fence lines were soldiers. There wasn't just one. There were several of them, spaced out along the old wooden fences, as if they had been waiting there for a very long time. I remember seeing them with incredible clarity. Some stood casually with their arms resting on the fence posts. Others leaned against the rails as though they were taking a brief break. One detail has stayed with me more than anything else. A few of them appeared to be chewing on pieces of straw. It wasn't dramatic. They weren't marching. They weren't fighting. They weren't looking at me. They simply stood there, quietly occupying the landscape as naturally as if they belonged there. Nothing about the scene felt rushed or frightening. It was strangely calm. At 13 years old, I didn't immediately think, I'm seeing ghosts. Instead, I simply stared. The image felt completely real. They looked solid enough that I didn't question what I was seeing in that moment. It wasn't until we had driven farther down the road that I began wondering why nobody else seemed to be reacting. No one in the car said anything. My parents kept talking normally. The conversation continued exactly as it had before. I glanced around, half expecting someone else to point toward the fence. No one did. I looked back outside. The soldiers were gone. I never mentioned what I'd seen. I honestly wasn't sure how to explain it. Part of me wondered whether I had imagined the entire thing. Maybe I'd been thinking about the battlefield before we arrived. Maybe my imagination had filled the landscape with scenes from the past. It seemed like the most reasonable explanation, so I kept it to myself. The trip continued. We explored Gettysburg like countless other visitors do. We walked around the historic sites, looked at monuments, and learned more about what had happened there generations earlier. Eventually, we went home. As the years passed, I thought about that drive from time to time. The memory never really faded. If anything, it remained unusually vivid. I could still picture the fence lines. I could still remember the relaxed way the soldiers stood. Most of all, I could still see the ones chewing on pieces of straw. It was such an ordinary little detail that it made the memory feel strangely convincing. At the same time, I remained skeptical of my own experience. Memory isn't perfect. People remember things differently as they get older. I figured my mind had probably mixed history, imagination, and childhood curiosity into one unusually realistic memory. For years, that explanation seemed good enough. Then, several years later, something happened that completely caught me off guard. My dad and I were talking about that old family trip to Gettysburg. It wasn't even a conversation about ghosts. We were simply reminiscing about places we'd visited over the years. Eventually, Gettysburg came up. As we talked about the battlefield, my dad casually mentioned something he'd experienced during the drive into the area. His tone changed slightly as he began describing it. He said that while we were driving, he'd seen soldiers standing along the fences. I remember feeling my attention lock onto every word he said. He described them quietly standing beside the fence posts. Some appeared to be leaning against the rails. Others looked completely relaxed. He wasn't describing an active battlefield. He wasn't talking about dramatic visions of combat. He described almost exactly what I remembered seeing. For a moment, I didn't even know how to respond. I had never told him what I'd seen that day. Not once. I'd kept the experience entirely to myself ever since I was 13 years old. There was no reason for his description to sound so familiar. When he finished telling his story, I finally admitted that I'd seen something too. I described the soldiers I remembered standing along the fence lines as we drove into Gettysburg. I mentioned the men leaning casually against the fence. Then I told him about the detail that had stayed with me all those years. Some of them had seemed to be chewing on straw. The more we talked, the more surprising the conversation became. Neither of us had realized the other had experienced anything unusual during that trip. We had both quietly carried the memory for years without ever mentioning it. I don't know exactly what my father thought about it afterward. I know it surprised both of us. Neither of us tried to convince the other that what we'd seen had definitely been supernatural. Neither of us claimed to have all the answers. We simply realized that we'd had remarkably similar experiences during the same drive. Even now, I still don't know what happened. Gettysburg is a place with an extraordinary history. Millions of people visit every year because of what happened there. Knowing that history, it's easy to imagine how a person's mind might fill in the empty fields with images from the past. Maybe that's exactly what happened. Maybe our expectations influenced what we thought we saw. Maybe the landscape itself encourages that kind of imagination. Those explanations seem entirely possible. At the same time, it's difficult for me to ignore one simple fact. I never told my father about what I saw. He never told me about what he experienced. Years passed before either of us mentioned it. Yet, when the subject finally came up, our memories shared striking similarities. I still consider myself a fairly rational person. Whenever I hear stories about haunted places, I usually assume there's an ordinary explanation. Most experiences can probably be explained through coincidence, perception, suggestion, or the strange ways memory changes over time. I don't think every unexplained event has to be paranormal. This one, though, has always stayed with me. Not because it proved anything, not because I believe I have evidence of ghosts, but because I have never been able to fully explain why my father and I remembered seeing something so similar without ever discussing it beforehand. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation that neither of us has considered. Maybe the power of history, expectation, and memory can produce experiences that feel astonishingly real. Or maybe some places hold on to the past in ways we don't yet understand. I honestly don't know. All I know is that whenever I think back to that family trip, I don't first remember the monuments, the museums, or even the battlefield itself. I remember looking out the car window as we slowly drove into Gettysburg and seeing quiet soldiers standing along the old fence lines, some leaning against the weathered posts, others calmly chewing on pieces of straw, as though they had simply paused for a moment and were waiting for something that had ended long before we arrived. Whether they were only memories created by my imagination or something far more difficult to explain is a question I've never been able to answer. Even after all these years, that quiet moment remains one of the clearest memories from that trip, made even stranger by discovering much later that my father remembered seeing something remarkably similar without either of us ever speaking about it beforehand. The Girl in the Woods. One summer when I was about 12 years old, two of my friends and I decided to explore the woods behind my old house. We'd been back there before, and it seemed like the perfect way to spend the day. None of us planned on going very far. We were just wandering through the trees, talking, joking around, and seeing where the different trails led. At some point, though, we completely lost track of time. It felt like only a little while had passed, but before we realized it, the sun had gone down. The woods changed almost immediately. Everything that had seemed familiar during the day suddenly looked different. The trees blended together, the paths became harder to recognize, and every direction looked exactly the same. That's when we realized we were lost. At first, we tried to stay calm. We picked a direction and started walking, convinced we'd eventually come across a trail or find our way back to my neighborhood. Instead, it felt like the forest just kept going. The farther we walked, the more it seemed as though there was no end to it. Everywhere we looked was nothing but darkness and trees. Then we heard a gunshot. The sound echoed through the woods. None of us stopped to think about where it had come from. We just ran. We sprinted as fast as we could through the trees, trying to get away from whatever had made that sound. Somewhere during all the confusion, I became separated from my friends. One moment, we were running together. The next, I was completely alone. I called out for them, but nobody answered. I kept walking, hoping I'd hear their voices or see their flashlights, but there was nothing. After a while, I couldn't keep going. I was exhausted, scared, and had no idea where I was. Eventually, I sat down against a tree and decided to stay there. I figured wandering around in the dark would only make things worse, so I waited. I don't know how long I sat there. It felt like forever. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional sounds of leaves moving in the breeze. Then I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I felt relieved. I assumed my friends had finally found me. I stood up and turned around, expecting to see one of them. Instead, I saw a little girl. She was standing there in the darkness. I didn't recognize her. I had no idea why another child would be alone in those woods at night. Confused and frightened, I asked her, "Can you help me?" The moment I spoke, she screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. Even after all these years, it's still one of the most frightening sounds I've ever heard. Then she answered me. In the deepest, most unnatural voice I've ever heard, she said, "No. You'll stay." The words froze me where I stood. I'd never heard a voice like that before. It didn't sound like it belonged to a little girl. It sounded wrong. I screamed. A few moments later, my friends came running toward me. They told me they'd heard me yelling and followed the sound of my voice until they found me. I immediately looked around for the little girl. She was gone. There was no sign of her anywhere. The three of us stayed together after that. Eventually, somehow, we managed to find our way out of the woods and make it back to my house. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe fear, darkness, and exhaustion played tricks on my mind. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, I've never forgotten that scream or those 4 words. For the next couple of weeks, I refused to leave the house. Even now, whenever I think about walking through the woods after dark, I remember turning around, expecting to find my friends, and finding that little girl instead. The house never felt right. Some of the strangest experiences I've ever had all happened at my grandmother's house. Looking back, I can't honestly say what caused any of them. Maybe there were perfectly ordinary explanations that we never discovered. Maybe old houses simply have a way of making everyday things seem unsettling. Whatever the reason, that house always felt different. The strange part is that I wasn't the only one who experienced unusual things there. Other members of my family had their own stories, and over the years we all witnessed things that were difficult to explain. As a kid, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house. It should have felt familiar. It should have been one of those places where you could completely relax. Instead, there was always something about it that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't constant fear. It was more like the feeling that the house wasn't quite as ordinary as it appeared. Sometimes objects would seem to move on their own. Other times, things would happen that simply didn't make sense. As a child, I couldn't explain any of it. I only knew that every visit seemed to bring another strange experience. Part of the reason people in my family wondered about the house was because of my grandmother herself. When she was younger, she had been fascinated by anything mysterious. She loved stories about the supernatural and spent a lot of time reading about paranormal subjects. She even owned a Ouija board. She kept it stored away in the closet of the guest bedroom. That happened to be the room where I always slept whenever I stayed at her house. Whether the Ouija board had anything to do with the strange experiences, I have no idea. Maybe it was just another object sitting forgotten in a closet. Still, knowing it was there always added another layer of uneasiness to the room. The guest bedroom had an unusual history of its own. Years earlier, it had been used as a recording studio. Because of that, the walls had been professionally soundproofed. During the day, the room was incredibly quiet. Outside noises barely made it through the walls. That made the nights even stranger. Every so often, while lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I'd hear sounds coming from somewhere in the room. Small noises, unexplained bumps, occasional creaks. Sometimes it sounded as though something had shifted inside the room itself. The unsettling part wasn't simply hearing noises. It was knowing how well the room blocked outside sound. If the walls were designed to keep noise out, then where were those sounds coming from? As a child, I found that thought terrifying. One afternoon, while running around the house like most kids do, I had another experience that has stayed with me ever since. I was moving through the hallway when I noticed my grandmother standing near the entrance to the guest bedroom. At first glance, I assumed it was her. Then something felt wrong. I couldn't immediately explain why. She looked like my grandmother, but there was something different about her. Not dramatically different. Just enough that I instinctively knew something wasn't quite right. Before I had the chance to say anything, She turned and walked into my grandfather's study. That room was where my grandfather spent much of his time working on his firearms. I watched her walk inside. Naturally, I followed. I rounded the corner only a moment later. The room was empty. I stopped in the doorway and looked around. There wasn't anywhere she could have gone. The study had only one entrance and one exit. The one I had just used. There wasn't a closet inside the room. The only enclosed space was the large gun safe standing in one corner. My grandmother wasn't there. She hadn't walked back past me. She hadn't slipped through another door. She had simply disappeared. I remember standing there trying to understand what had just happened. As a kid, I couldn't think of any explanation. Eventually, I walked away, but I never completely forgot that moment. Another experience happened late one night. I had gotten out of bed because I wanted a glass of water. The house was quiet. Everyone else had already gone to sleep. I walked into the kitchen, filled a glass, and set it down on the table in front of me. For a second, everything was perfectly still. Then I watched the glass begin to move, slowly, almost gently. It slid across the tabletop by itself. I didn't touch it. No one else was in the room. I simply stood there watching as it moved. It wasn't fast. It didn't tip over. It just continued sliding across the table before finally coming to a stop. I remember staring at it, unsure of what I'd just witnessed. When I later told my mom about it, she didn't dismiss the story. Instead, she told me she'd seen something similar happen in that same house. She had watched objects move in ways she couldn't explain. Hearing that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made the experience more unsettling because I knew I wasn't the only one. Over the years, those weren't the only strange things connected to my grandparents' house. There were other moments, other stories, small experiences that didn't seem important by themselves, but gradually built a reputation around the house. Every family gathering seemed to produce another unexplained memory from someone who had spent time there. Some people experienced odd noises. Others noticed things where they shouldn't have been. Everyone seemed to have at least one story. I've spent years trying to think of logical explanations. Old houses settle. Floors shift. Furniture can move slightly if a surface isn't perfectly level. Childhood memories aren't always completely accurate. All of those explanations make sense. Even so, they don't completely erase the memories. I can still picture the figure that looked almost like my grandmother walking into a room and disappearing. I can still remember watching that glass slowly slide across the table while I stood there alone. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason behind every one of those experiences. Maybe there wasn't. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that my grandmother's house remains the place where I've experienced more unexplained things than anywhere else I've ever been. And while I could probably tell several more stories about that house, these are the ones that have stayed with me the longest. Even now, years later, whenever someone asks if I've ever experienced anything I couldn't explain, my mind always goes back to that old house and everything that seemed just a little too strange to ignore. The man in the courtyard. One of the strangest experiences I've ever had happened while I was in Eastern Russia. It wasn't dramatic or violent, and nothing ever tried to hurt me. In fact, if someone had asked me to describe it in a single word, I'd probably say it was simply impossible. Even now, I still replay the memory in my mind, trying to figure out what I missed. It was well after midnight, and I couldn't sleep. Rather than stay inside, I decided to head down into the courtyard between the apartment towers where I was staying. The complex had a small outdoor exercise area with pull-up bars and other basic workout equipment. and I figured I'd get a quick workout in before heading back upstairs. The courtyard was quiet. Most of the lights from the surrounding apartment buildings were still on, but very few people were outside at that hour. The place had that familiar stillness that only seems to exist after midnight, when the sounds of traffic have faded and even large neighborhoods feel strangely empty. I started my workout and settled into a routine. After a few sets of pull-ups, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. An older man had entered the courtyard. He was walking alone. What caught my attention wasn't the fact that he was there, but the way he moved. He walked incredibly slowly. Each step was short and careful, almost as though every movement required effort. He shuffled forward at such a slow pace that it took him several minutes just to cross from the edge of the courtyard to the area where I was exercising. I watched him on and off between sets. Nothing about him seemed threatening. He simply continued making his way across the open space, one small step at a time. Eventually, he stopped about 40 feet away from me. He looked in my direction. Then he gave a slight nod. It wasn't exaggerated, just a small, quiet acknowledgement. I nodded back almost automatically and returned to my workout. I grabbed the pull-up bar and started another set. My focus shifted to counting the repetitions. 1, 2, 3. I worked my way through 20 pull-ups without stopping. The entire set only took a short time. When I finished, I dropped back to the ground and turned around to look toward the place where the old man had been standing. He was gone, not walking away, not farther across the courtyard. Gone. I immediately looked around the entire area. The courtyard stretched for several hundred feet in every direction. It was wide open, with very little that could block someone's view for long. There was nowhere nearby that he could have hidden. More importantly, there wasn't enough time. I'd been facing away from him only long enough to complete a single set of 20 pull-ups, given the pace I'd watched him walk just moments earlier. There was simply no way he could have covered enough distance to disappear completely from sight. Only a minute before, it had taken him several minutes just to shuffle across part of the courtyard. Now there wasn't any sign of him at all. I stood there, scanning the open space, expecting to spot him somewhere in the distance. Nothing. The walkways were empty. The exercise area was empty. The courtyard was silent again. For a while, I tried to convince myself that I'd simply overlooked him. Maybe he'd turned a corner I hadn't noticed. Maybe one of the apartment entrances was closer than I'd realized. Maybe I'd spent longer doing my pull-ups than I remembered. I've considered every explanation I can think of. They all sound reasonable, until I remember how slowly he had been moving. That was the one thing I couldn't ignore. I had watched him shuffle across the courtyard at a painfully slow pace. Every step had been small. Every movement had been deliberate. There was no chance he suddenly sprinted away while I wasn't looking. Nothing else unusual happened that night. I finished my workout, headed back upstairs, and tried not to think too much about it. Still, the memory has stayed with me. I've experienced plenty of strange coincidences over the years, but this one continues to stand out because it was so ordinary until that final moment. There was no dramatic ending, no frightening encounter, just an elderly man who slowly walked into a quiet courtyard after midnight, stopped to give me a small nod from about 40 feet away, and somehow vanished during the few seconds it took me to finish a set of pull-ups. Whether there was a perfectly ordinary explanation or something I'll never understand, I honestly don't know. All I know is that when I turned around, the courtyard was exactly as quiet and empty as it had been before he arrived. The only difference was that the man who should still have been standing there simply wasn't. The unheard guest? My cousin stayed at our house for about a month because we had both enrolled in the same college entrance exam tutorial center. It made sense for her to stay with us instead of traveling back and forth every day, and before long, we had settled into a comfortable routine. We slept in my older sister's room together. It wasn't a huge room, but it was cozy enough for the two of us. We spent most evenings studying, talking about our classes, and worrying about the entrance exams. During the day, whenever we weren't at the tutorial center, we'd usually sit in the room with our books spread across the bed or the floor, trying our best to stay focused. One afternoon felt completely ordinary. The house was quiet. My sister wasn't home, and the rest of my family was busy in other parts of the house. The sunlight coming through the window gave the room a warm, peaceful feeling. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing unusual seemed likely to happen. My cousin's phone rang. She looked at the screen and smiled when she saw it was her family calling to check on her. She answered, and almost immediately I could hear the familiar rhythm of a casual family conversation. They were asking how she was doing, whether she was eating enough, how our review classes were going, and all the usual questions parents ask when someone has been away from home for a while. I barely paid any attention. I was sitting nearby with my notes open, completely focused on studying. I wasn't saying a word. I was reading silently, trying to memorize formulas and information for the upcoming entrance exams. The room remained calm. The only sounds were the pages of my notebook, my cousin's voice as she answered her family, and the occasional muffled noises coming from somewhere else in the house. Then everything changed because of one simple sentence. From the other end of the phone, my cousin's younger sister suddenly interrupted. "Hey, tell Andy to stop talking. I can't hear you over the phone." My cousin frowned. She looked directly at me. I looked back at her, confused. I hadn't spoken at all. Not a single word. I had been reading silently the entire time. My cousin hesitated before answering. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Her younger sister repeated herself. "Tell Andy to stop talking. It's hard to hear you." At first, we both thought maybe she was joking. There didn't seem to be any other explanation. I remember giving my cousin a confused look, almost expecting her little sister to laugh and admit she was teasing us, but that didn't happen. Instead, her mother spoke up, too. She sounded completely serious. She said they could hear someone talking in the background, not just random noises, not a television, not another conversation happening elsewhere in the house. Someone talking. According to both of them, there was another voice coming from our side of the phone. They said it kept distracting them while they were trying to hear my cousin. The room suddenly didn't feel as peaceful anymore. My cousin slowly lowered the phone and looked at me again. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. There wasn't much to say. We were the only two people inside the room. I hadn't spoken. There wasn't a television on. No music was playing. No videos were running. The hallway outside was quiet. The rest of the house wasn't making enough noise for voices to somehow sound like someone speaking right beside us. Still, both her younger sister and her mother insisted they could hear another person talking. My cousin finally answered them. She told them there wasn't anyone else there. She explained that I had been studying quietly the entire time and hadn't said a single word since she answered the call. There was a brief silence on the line. Then they repeated themselves once again. They were sure they had heard someone, not just once, several times. Someone speaking while my cousin was talking to them. I could feel my stomach tightening. At first, I tried convincing myself there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe the phone connection was picking up another conversation somehow. Maybe another call had crossed into theirs. Maybe someone outside was talking loudly enough to be picked up by the microphone, but none of those explanations really fit. The room was almost completely silent. If there had been another voice, both my cousin and I should have heard it too. We hadn't. Not even a whisper. My cousin's expression changed from confusion to genuine uneasiness. I could tell she wasn't pretending to be scared. She kept glancing around the room as though she expected to find someone standing in a corner we hadn't noticed before. I found myself doing the same thing. It sounds strange now, but in that moment, we both instinctively looked around, even though we knew there was nowhere for another person to hide. The closet door was closed. The window was shut. The bedroom door was open enough for us to see part of the hallway. Everything looked exactly the way it had only minutes earlier. Completely normal, yet the conversation on the phone had made the room feel different. Her mother and younger sister continued insisting that another person had been speaking. Not shouting, not whispering, just talking naturally in the background as if someone else had been sitting beside my cousin the entire time. The stranger's voice had apparently been clear enough that her younger sister assumed it was me. That was the part that stayed with me. She didn't ask who the other person was. She specifically told my cousin to tell me to stop talking. As far as she was concerned, she was hearing my voice. Except I hadn't made a sound. I remember sitting there with my notebook still open in front of me, unable to concentrate anymore. The words on the page blurred together while I kept replaying everything that had just happened. Had I accidentally muttered something without realizing it? No, I knew I hadn't. I had been silently reading the entire time. My cousin knew that too. She had been sitting close enough to notice if I had spoken even one sentence. After the call ended, we talked about it for a while. Neither of us could come up with a reasonable explanation. The more we discussed it, the stranger it seemed. If only one person on the other end had mentioned hearing another voice, maybe we could have dismissed it as a misunderstanding. But both her younger sister and her mother heard it. They both described the same thing, someone talking in the background. Someone they believed was me. The atmosphere inside the room felt noticeably different after that. Nothing had physically changed. The furniture stayed where it was. The afternoon sunlight still came through the window. The air was still. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet neither of us felt quite as comfortable sitting there anymore. Every small sound suddenly caught our attention. If the house creaked, we'd look up. If we heard footsteps elsewhere, we'd stop what we were doing for a moment. It wasn't because we had seen anything. We hadn't. It was because neither of us could stop thinking about the voice that only two people on the other end of a phone call seemed able to hear. Eventually, we tried to move on. We still had exams to prepare for, and life didn't stop because of one strange experience. We went back to studying. We continued attending our tutorial classes. The days passed as they normally would. Still, every now and then, one of us would casually bring it up again. Do you think they were joking? No, they sounded serious. I know. Then what did they hear? Neither of us ever had an answer. Even now, when I think back on that afternoon, that's the part that unsettles me the most. There wasn't any dramatic event. Nothing moved. No shadows crossed the room. No doors opened by themselves. No strange figure appeared. It was just an ordinary afternoon, interrupted by a phone call and a question that shouldn't have existed. Tell Andy to stop talking. A simple sentence. Completely normal on its own, except I had never spoken in the first place. To this day, I still don't know who or what they heard speaking from our side of the call. And no matter how many ordinary explanations I try to come up with, None of them fully explain why two different people were so certain they had heard a voice in that quiet room when my cousin and I knew there had only been silence. Even after all this time, that memory has stayed with me. And it's still one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. I still have many stories to tell. The Woman in White. This happened, I think, sometime around 2012, although I can't remember the exact year. My family and I had traveled to the Philippines for a vacation. We rented an apartment in a condominium complex that had all the amenities that were popular at the time, like a swimming pool, a clubhouse, and other shared facilities. It seemed like a nice place to stay, and nothing about it stood out as unusual when we first arrived. My two brothers and I shared one bedroom. They slept on the bunk bed, while I slept on a mattress on the floor. It wasn't the most comfortable setup, but it worked fine, and after spending our days exploring and swimming, all three of us usually fell asleep pretty quickly. One night, I woke up unexpectedly. I still don't know what woke me. The room was completely quiet, and everything seemed still. I had been sleeping on my back, and as I slowly opened my eyes, I immediately noticed someone standing in the room. At least, that's what it looked like. There was a woman, or something that felt like a woman, covered entirely in a white sheet. It wasn't like someone had simply thrown a blanket over their head. The sheet hung naturally around her body, almost as though it was the clothing she was wearing. It covered her from head to toe, but it didn't drape over her face in the way a costume would. Somehow, it looked more like a long white garment than an ordinary sheet. She wasn't moving. She was simply there. For a few seconds, I couldn't do anything except stare. I remember feeling completely overwhelmed with fear. The only thought that entered my mind was, if I'm going to die, just close your eyes. So I did. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could. I didn't scream. I didn't try to wake my brothers. I just kept my eyes closed, and somehow, eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The memory of what I'd seen was still fresh in my mind, but I tried to convince myself it had only been a vivid dream. People have strange dreams all the time, especially when they're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. That explanation seemed reasonable enough, so I tried not to dwell on it. Instead, I got on with the day. The rest of the morning was spent relaxing with my family by the pool. We swam, talked, and enjoyed our vacation while my mom stayed behind at the apartment to tidy up and get lunch ready. By the time we returned, everything felt completely normal again. As we walked inside, my mom casually mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. While she had been alone in the apartment, sweeping the living room floor, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. She said she had seen a white figure move across her peripheral vision. According to her, it looked like someone covered in a white sheet. She mentioned it so casually that I don't think she realized how much those words affected me. The moment she said it, I felt the same uneasy feeling I had experienced the night before. Until then, I had been telling myself I'd imagined everything. Hearing my mom describe seeing what sounded like the exact same figure made it much harder to dismiss. I told her what had happened to me during the night. For a moment, neither of us really knew what to say. Neither of us tried to convince the other of anything. We simply realized that we'd both experienced something we couldn't explain. Oddly enough, that was the end of it. We didn't spend the rest of the vacation talking about ghosts. We didn't leave the apartment. We didn't let it ruin our trip. After acknowledging what had happened, we more or less stopped discussing it and carried on enjoying our holiday as planned. Nothing else unusual happened while we were there. I've thought about those two experiences many times since then. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation. Perhaps I had been half asleep and experienced an unusually vivid dream. Maybe my mom caught a glimpse of a curtain, a towel, or some trick of the light while she was cleaning. Those possibilities certainly exist, but it's difficult to ignore the timing. I saw what I believed was a woman dressed entirely in white during the night. The following morning, without knowing anything about my experience, my mom casually mentioned seeing what she described as a white-sheeted figure while she was alone in the apartment. Neither of us had influenced the other's memory. Neither of us had mentioned anything beforehand, whether it was an extraordinary coincidence, a pair of unrelated experiences that happened to sound similar, or something far more mysterious. I honestly don't know. All I know is that whenever I think back to that vacation in the Philippines, I remember more than the swimming pool, the sunny afternoons, and the family time. I also remember waking in the middle of the night, opening my eyes, and seeing a silent figure, dressed completely in white, standing in the room, and I remember realizing the next day that I wasn't the only one who thought they had seen her. Watching from the basement. When I was still living with my parents, I worked fairly late hours. It wasn't unusual for me to come home long after everyone else had already gone to bed, and sometimes I'd arrive to find the entire house completely empty. I had grown used to it. After a while, walking into a dark, quiet house late at night became part of my routine. I'd unlock the front door, step inside, and make my way through the kitchen before settling in for the night. It was something I'd done so many times that I barely thought about it anymore. The layout of the house was simple. As soon as you came through the entrance, you walked into the kitchen. To reach the rest of the house, you had to pass the doorway leading to the basement stairs. The staircase descended into a dark basement that wasn't visible from the top, unless you deliberately looked down. Most nights, I didn't. I'd walk right past it without giving it a second thought. One night, though, everything felt different. I came home from work late, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The house was completely empty. No television, no music, no conversations coming from another room, just silence. I remember closing the door behind me and walking through the kitchen exactly as I always did. As I passed the basement stairs, something caught my attention. There was movement, very slow movement. At first, I only noticed it from the corner of my eye. It wasn't quick enough to startle me immediately. It was almost the opposite. Something was shifting so slowly that it took my brain a moment to recognize that anything was moving at all. I stopped walking. Then I turned toward the staircase. At the bottom of the stairs, staring directly up at me, was a face. Even now, it's difficult to describe, because it didn't resemble any person I've ever seen. The first thing that struck me was its size. It was enormous. The face alone looked roughly the size of a human torso. That was what immediately felt wrong. Nothing with a face that large should have been standing at the bottom of my parents' basement stairs. Its skin looked brown and deeply wrinkled, not just aged, almost dried out somehow. Its features were fixed on me. It wasn't looking around. It wasn't hiding. It was simply staring. Its mouth slowly opened, then slowly closed, opened again, closed again, over and over. No sound came from it. It didn't growl. It didn't breathe loudly. It didn't speak. It simply watched me while its mouth continued that slow, repetitive motion. I have no idea how long we looked at each other. Probably only a few seconds. It felt much longer. The strange thing is that I didn't scream. I didn't run. I didn't even say anything. I think my brain simply failed to process what I was seeing. Instead, I did something that still seems bizarre when I think about it now. I turned away and kept walking almost automatically. It was as if my mind had decided that continuing toward the living room was somehow more manageable than trying to understand what I'd just seen. I remember my heart racing afterward, but during those first moments, I felt almost numb, like I was functioning on instinct instead of conscious thought. Once I reached the other room, the reality of what had happened finally started catching up with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the face. Every detail replayed in my mind: the impossible size, the brown, wrinkled skin, the way it silently opened and closed its mouth, the fact that it had been staring directly at me. I knew one thing immediately. I didn't want to be alone. The house suddenly felt enormous. Every quiet room seemed unsettling. Every creak made me look toward the hallway. I had absolutely no desire to go anywhere near the basement staircase again. So I called a friend. I explained that I really didn't want to spend the night alone and asked if they could come over. Thankfully, they agreed. Just having another person in the house made me feel a little more grounded. I never told them every detail immediately, because saying it out loud somehow made it feel even stranger. Even hearing myself describe it sounded unbelievable. Before that night, there had already been things about the house that made me uneasy. Nothing I could actually see, just sounds. The basement in particular always seemed to produce noises that didn't make much sense. Every so often, I'd hear what sounded like something bouncing off the basement walls. Not a single thump, more like an object striking one wall, then another, then another. The sounds echoed upward through the staircase. Each time it happened, I'd eventually work up the courage to go downstairs and check. Nothing was ever out of place. No boxes had fallen. No tools had rolled across the floor. No shelves had collapsed. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Eventually, I started convincing myself the noises had ordinary explanations. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe pipes were making strange sounds. Maybe something stored in the basement shifted naturally. Whatever the cause was, I never found evidence of anything unusual. Those sounds were unsettling, but they were still just sounds. The face was different. That was the only thing I ever actually saw. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation. Fatigue, lighting, mistaken perception, shadows. I've considered all of them. Coming home late after work certainly doesn't make anyone more alert. Maybe my brain misinterpreted something sitting in the basement. Maybe darkness distorted what I thought I was looking at. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation that simply wasn't obvious in the moment. I honestly don't know. What makes it difficult is how vivid the memory still is. I don't remember vague shapes. I remember details: the wrinkled skin, the enormous size, the slow movement of its mouth, the way it remained completely silent. Most of all, I remember the feeling that something was looking back at me. Eventually, I moved out of my parents' house. Life changed. I stopped thinking about that night quite as often. Still, every time I visit, one part of the house immediately brings the memory back. The kitchen, specifically the basement stairs. The layout hasn't changed. To do almost anything in the kitchen, you naturally end up turning your back toward the staircase. Whether you're making coffee, washing dishes, or preparing food, you're standing there, facing the counters, while the basement entrance sits quietly behind you. I still don't like it. Even now, I catch myself wanting to glance over my shoulder. Not constantly, just enough to reassure myself that nothing is standing there. It's an uncomfortable feeling that has never completely disappeared. I've never seen that face again. Nothing remotely similar has happened since. The strange noises in the basement never escalated into anything I could verify. The face remains the only experience I can't explain. If someone else told me this story, I'd probably search for a rational explanation before accepting anything supernatural. I'd wonder whether exhaustion played a role. I'd question how memory changes over time. I'd think about the tricks darkness can play on the human mind. Those explanations are all possible. Maybe one of them is correct. I genuinely hope one of them is. But no matter how many possibilities I consider, I still come back to the same memory. Coming home after work, walking through an empty house, passing the basement stairs, noticing something moving slowly in the darkness, turning to look, and seeing an impossibly large, brown, deeply wrinkled face silently staring up at me while its mouth opened and closed without making a single sound. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't claim to have an answer. All I know is that it remains the only experience from that house that I can't comfortably explain away. The strange sounds in the basement eventually became something I could ignore, but that silent face has stayed with me for years. Even now, whenever I'm alone in my parents' house, I still find myself avoiding the basement stairs whenever I can. And if I have to stand in the kitchen with my back to them, I almost always end up looking over my shoulder, just to make sure nothing is quietly watching from below. When I was around 8 years old, I went through a period where bedtime was never easy. I always slept with the lights on. Part of the reason was that I kept seeing what looked like a man standing outside my bedroom window. It terrified me, and eventually my family and I came to believe those sightings were probably hallucinations or tricks of my imagination. Whether they were caused by fear, an overactive imagination, or something else, I don't really know. Either way, I hated going to sleep in the dark. One night, while I was lying awake in bed with the light still on, I felt the mattress dip beside me. It was the unmistakable feeling of someone sitting on the edge of the bed. A moment later, I felt a hand gently stroking my hair. It was soft and reassuring. Still half awake, I assumed it had to be one of my parents checking on me. That wasn't unusual, so I wasn't frightened. I slowly opened my eyes. Sitting beside me wasn't either of my parents. Instead, there was a middle-aged man I had never seen before. He wasn't transparent or frightening. The only unusual thing about him was that he seemed to be glowing with a soft yellow light. It wasn't bright enough to hurt my eyes. It was more like a gentle golden warmth surrounding him. He looked at me and smiled. Normally, I was an incredibly shy child. I was afraid of almost everything. Meeting a complete stranger in my bedroom should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something I still find difficult to explain. I felt completely safe. There wasn't even a hint of fear. His smile was calm and comforting, and for reasons I still don't understand, I felt as though everything was going to be all right. I didn't scream. I didn't call for my parents. I simply relaxed. Within moments, I drifted back to sleep. By the following morning, I had mostly convinced myself it must have been some strange dream. As the months passed, I thought about it less and less. Then, about a year or two later, something happened that brought the memory rushing back. My mum was talking about her father, who had died when she was still a teenager. It wasn't unusual for her to tell stories about him from time to time. During the conversation, she mentioned that she had finally found the only photograph she had of him. For years, she believed it had been lost when the family moved abroad. She showed me the picture. The moment I looked at it, I froze. The man in the photograph was the same man who had sat beside my bed. The same face, the same smile, the same middle-aged man I remembered seeing surrounded by that soft yellow glow. It was my grandfather. The strange part was that I couldn't have recognized him. He had died long before I was old enough to know him, and as far as I was aware, I'd never seen that photograph before. My mum herself had believed it was lost for years. Even then, I didn't tell anyone. I kept the experience to myself, partly because I assumed no one would believe me, mostly because I wasn't sure I believed it myself. It seemed much more reasonable to assume I'd had an unusually vivid dream, and that recognizing my grandfather in the photograph was nothing more than an extraordinary coincidence. So I stayed quiet. Years passed. I rarely thought about it anymore. Then, during a family gathering, the subject of my grandfather came up again. One story led to another, and before long several relatives began sharing experiences they believed they'd had after his death. Some described feeling his presence. Others talked about moments they couldn't explain. Listening to them, I realized I wasn't the only person in the family with a story like mine. For the first time, I considered telling everyone what had happened to me as a child. Even then, I hesitated. It still sounded unbelievable, even to me. Eventually, I shared it. To my surprise, no one laughed. No one dismissed it outright. Instead, they simply listened. Looking back now, I still don't know what happened that night. Perhaps it really was just a dream, and years later my memory connected it to the photograph in a way that felt convincing. Memory can be remarkably powerful, especially when we're recalling childhood experiences. That's entirely possible. On the other hand, hearing so many members of my family describe experiences they believed involved my grandfather has always made me wonder. Maybe we all interpreted ordinary events through the lens of grief and family stories. Or maybe there was something more to it. I honestly don't know. All I know is that one night, when I was a frightened little girl who usually feared almost everything, a stranger sat gently on the edge of my bed, stroked my hair, smiled at me, and somehow made me feel completely safe. Years later, I discovered that the stranger's face matched the only photograph my mum had of the father she lost as a teenager. Whether my entire family is simply very imaginative, or whether my grandfather wasn't quite ready to say goodbye until he'd watched over all of us one last time, I'll probably never know. But whenever I think back to that night, I don't remember feeling frightened. I remember feeling safe enough to close my eyes, smile back, and fall peacefully asleep. When I was growing up, my mum used to tell me she sometimes had dreams that seemed to predict things. Whenever she talked about them, I never took them seriously. I'd usually roll my eyes and tell myself it was just coincidence. After all, everyone has strange dreams from time to time, and if you have enough of them, eventually one is bound to line up with something that happens in real life. That was always my explanation. Then, as I got older, something strange started happening to me. It began with a dream. In the dream, my teeth started falling out. Sometimes they crumbled in my hands, other times they loosened one by one until they simply dropped out of my mouth. On a few occasions, they weren't just falling out, they were rotten, dark, and breaking apart. The details changed slightly from dream to dream, but the central image was always the same. Something was wrong with my teeth. The dreams always felt unusually vivid. When I woke up, I'd instinctively run my tongue across my teeth or check them in the mirror, relieved to discover everything was perfectly normal. At first, I didn't think much of it. Dreams about teeth are incredibly common. Lots of people have them. I assumed mine were no different. Then, not long after one of those dreams, someone died. It was heartbreaking. but I didn't connect the two events. The dream faded into the background. Sometime later, I had another dream about my teeth falling out. Again, it felt disturbingly realistic. Again, I woke up unsettled. Within a short time, someone else died. That was enough to make me pause. Even then, I refused to believe there was any connection. Two coincidences are still just coincidences. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But the pattern continued. Every single time I had one of those dreams, news of another death followed. It didn't seem to matter who it was. Sometimes, it was someone in my immediate family. Other times, it was a distant relative. Occasionally, it was someone connected to a close friend or another branch of the family. The relationship changed. The dream didn't. Each time, it was the same unsettling image of my teeth falling out, rotting, or breaking apart. After enough years passed, I stopped dismissing it quite so easily. I'm still not convinced the dreams predict anything. There are perfectly reasonable explanations. Dreams about losing teeth are among the most commonly reported dreams in the world and are often associated with stress, anxiety, or major life changes. It's also possible that, after noticing the pattern, my mind naturally became more likely to remember the dreams that happened before a loss, while forgetting all the times they didn't seem to lead to anything. Our memories are very good at finding patterns, especially during emotional events. I know that. Even so, it's difficult not to notice when the same thing appears to happen over and over again. Every time I wake from one of those dreams now, I can't help feeling uneasy. Not because I know something terrible is about to happen. I don't. But because, throughout my life, those dreams have so often been followed by news I never wanted to hear. Whether it's nothing more than an extraordinary series of coincidences or something I'll never fully understand, I honestly can't say. I only know that when I dream about my teeth falling out, part of me quietly hopes that, this time, the pattern finally ends. When I was little, something happened in our family that none of us thought much about at the time. It wasn't until years later, after everything had already unfolded, that we looked back on it differently. My stepmother became pregnant. Everyone was excited. A new baby meant a big change for our family, and we spent months looking forward to meeting him. During the pregnancy, the doctors discovered that she had actually been carrying twins. Very early on, though, one of the babies didn't survive. The loss happened so early in the pregnancy that the other baby continued developing normally. There were no major complications after that, and before long the pregnancy continued as though she were expecting only one child. Eventually, my little brother was born healthy. As far as anyone could tell, he was an ordinary little boy. He grew normally, hit all the milestones you would expect, and seemed perfectly happy. Our family consisted of 2 girls and him. There were no other little boys living in the house. Life settled into its usual routine. Then, once my brother became old enough to talk in complete sentences, he began saying something that caught everyone's attention. He would casually mention his brother. Not occasionally, all the time. At first, we assumed he was pretending. Young children invent imaginary friends all the time, so hearing him talk about someone who wasn't there didn't seem especially unusual. But the way he described this brother was different. He never spoke as though he had imagined him. To my brother, this little boy was simply there. It wasn't a game. It wasn't make-believe. It was a fact. He would run around the house playing with him. Sometimes he would race from one room to another, laughing as though someone was running beside him. Other times he would stop in the middle of a game and wait, as though his brother needed to catch up. If we happened to walk into the room while he was playing, he would often become frustrated if we only spoke to him. He insisted there were 2 children playing, not one. If one of us commented that he was having fun by himself, he would quickly correct us. No, he'd say. "My brother's here." He seemed genuinely confused that we couldn't see what he was talking about. It wasn't as though he was telling ghost stories or trying to scare anyone. He sounded completely sincere. To him, there really was another little boy beside him. Sometimes we'd ask what he had been doing while he was alone in his bedroom. His answer was always the same: I wasn't alone. He'd explain that he had been playing with his brother. He would describe the games they had been enjoying together as though they had both been there the entire time. The most unsettling part wasn't what he said. It was how naturally he said it. There was never any hesitation, no smile suggesting he was joking, no indication that he expected us to play along. Instead, he seemed honestly puzzled by our reactions. Every so often, one of us would ask him another question. What brother? Or, where is he? Without fail, my brother would point nearby or simply look toward the place where he believed his brother was standing. Then he'd ask us something that none of us really knew how to answer. Why can't you see him? He wasn't frightened. He wasn't upset. He just couldn't understand why the rest of us couldn't see the little boy who, in his mind, was always there. As time went on, these conversations became a normal part of life. We would hear him laughing in another room. When we checked on him, he'd explain that he and his brother were playing. If he was running through the hallway, he often acted as though someone was racing him. Sometimes he'd stop and wait before continuing, making room for the invisible child he believed was beside him. Looking back now, it's surprising how quickly we accepted it. Children have vivid imaginations, after all. We assumed that was all it was. Even so, every now and then someone would remember the pregnancy, the fact that there had originally been twins. The connection was difficult to ignore. Still, we didn't know what to make of it. No one encouraged the idea. No one tried to convince him he really had a brother. At the same time, we didn't want to upset him by arguing constantly about someone he clearly believed was real. So, life continued. He talked. We listened. Sometimes we smiled. Sometimes we exchanged uncertain glances with one another after he walked away. The conversations continued for quite a while. It wasn't something that happened only once or twice. His brother remained part of his everyday life for years. Then, when my brother was about 3 years old, something changed. By that point, my stepmother had decided to tell him the truth. She explained, in the simplest way a young child could understand, that when he had been growing inside her, there had been another baby with him, a twin. But that baby hadn't survived the pregnancy. She didn't tell him in a frightening way. She simply explained what had happened. After that conversation, something remarkable happened. He stopped talking about his brother. Completely, there wasn't a gradual change. He didn't slowly mention him less often. He simply stopped. The games ended. The conversations ended. He no longer insisted that someone else was beside him. If we asked what he was doing in his room, he'd simply answer without mentioning another child. From that point on, his invisible brother was never part of his daily life again. It was as though the explanation had closed, something that had remained open until then. Years have passed since all of this happened. My brother grew up like anyone else. Life moved on. But every now and then, someone in the family remembers those early years. We remember hearing him laugh while apparently playing with someone only he could see. We remember him becoming annoyed whenever we spoke as though he were alone. Most of all, we remember the confusion in his voice whenever he asked why none of us could see his brother standing right beside him. I've thought about it many times over the years. There are plenty of ordinary explanations. Young children often create imaginary companions, especially around the age when my brother was talking about his. Psychologists have written extensively about how common that is. Maybe his brother was simply an imaginary friend who happened to fit a remarkable coincidence. that's entirely possible. On the other hand, there's one detail that's always stayed with me. No one had ever told him about the twin. He wasn't aware that another baby had once shared the womb with him. That information wasn't something he could have remembered in any ordinary sense. At least, that's how it seemed to us. Then, once he finally learned the truth at the age of 3, he never mentioned his brother again. Whether that was coincidence, childhood imagination, or something none of us can explain, I honestly don't know. Even now, I can't say with certainty what was happening during those early years. I only know what we all witnessed. A little boy, too young to know he had once had a twin, spent years happily talking, playing, racing, and laughing with a brother that none of the rest of us could ever see. Then, one day, he learned there really had been another little boy with him before he was born. After that, the brother he'd insisted was always by his side was never mentioned again. Before you close this and drift off, I just want to say thank you for spending your night here. These stories only mean something because you're listening. If you'd like more calm nights like this one, subscribing means you'll never miss the next. Now, let your eyes close and let the night take it from here. Good night.